Hi, my name is Dr. Matthew Touch, and I am the Interim Director of the Ernest J. Gaines Center at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Keith Clark, Professor of English and African American Studies at George Mason University. A couple of years ago, he published Black Manhood in James Baldwin, Ernest J. Gaines, and August Wilson. And he has a forthcoming book on Gaines with LSU Press, and he has recently published a book on Ann Petrie. Good afternoon, Dr. Clark.
Hello, Matthew.
Are you doing well this afternoon?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, I thought we would just go through a couple of questions.
Okay.
Discuss, Gaines and his influence and his, his relevance today. So I guess really the first question is, what was your first encounter with Gaines and how did that get you involved with studying him?
Well, it was interesting when I was trying to trace actually the moment when I was introduced to Ernest Gaines, and I guess that question, there's a twofold answer. So as a kid, and I talked about this when I interviewed him last year at the Louisiana Book Festival, I recall as a child seeing the film, The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. I think I was maybe 10 or 11 years old when it was on television. And so that was my introduction to Ernest Gaines, even though I didn't read the book and had never heard of him. But in terms of my actual introduction to his written words, that didn't come until much later, after I graduated from, finished my undergraduate degree. And in my second year of graduate school, a master's program at the University of Kentucky, Robert Hemingway asked me to teach the course in African American literature as a graduate student, and I jumped at that chance. And this was, I'm dating myself now, but this was back in 1986, 86, 87. So this was long before the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. So what we used was the Kinnaman Barksdale anthology. As a matter of fact, let me hold it up for your viewers here. This is the venerable Barksdale Kinnaman anthology of comprehensive Black writers of America, and this was the standard anthology before the Norton, and so this is what I used, and it has The Sky is Gray is in here, and so that was my introduction, was teaching Ernest Gaines to undergraduates at the University of Kentucky, teaching that short story. And then when I started the doctoral program at Chapel Hill a few years later, we read, it was a survey course on African American writers. And so we did A Gathering of Old Men, which I'd never heard of. So, and from there, the paper that I wrote for that class actually became an article that I subsequently published in Callaloo a few years later. So that was my path to Ernest Gaines.
That sounds kind of like a couple of other stories I've heard. The film was huge in 1974 with Pittman. Yeah. With me, actually, you seem to kind of be the same situation with me. I didn't read him until after my undergrad.
Yeah.
I read him, I think, maybe even after my master's.
Yeah.
But your story, I think, sounds really interesting because you were asked to teach him. You were a graduate student.
Right.
Asked to teach him actually in an undergraduate class. So
yeah.
There's no better way to actually learn material, in my opinion, except to get prepared to teach it.
Absolutely.
You don't want to make yourself look like a...
Yeah, I mean, you have to familiarize yourself with it. You have to, make sure you can cover all of the major themes and the characters. And so it was really good. It was intimidating, as a graduate student, teaching undergraduate literature course, but it really opened my eyes. I also was introduced to Ann Petrie at that point as well. So that teaching that class was really a momentous occasion for me.
Yeah, and I think the thing too, the fact that you're teaching The Sky is Great. I mean, that's one of the ones that teachers teach in high school, they teach in college. I think they even teach it sometimes in middle school. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious, what was that like, and have you used it in your classes before too?
Yeah, I use it frequently, and I, to be honest with you, I really love the film version of that. I just think it's so wonderful, and so I frequently read it and teach it as a text so I can show the film. And it deals with so many issues that are still germane, And so, yeah, it's a wonderful story.
What do you mean by it deals with so many issues that are still germane?
Well, I mean, we think about its stark depiction of a Jim Crow South and the Jim Crow South regime, and what my students, sometimes with my prodding, but what they often see is that, well, while the Jim Crow regime has officially ended in terms of law, that there's still remnants of that. And so we talk about things like the uh, uh, prison industrial complex, and we talk about things like redlining, and how race gets spaced, the spatial implications of race, the class distinctions, even issues about medical care and what type of medical care people on the low end of the totem pole get versus people who have means. And so, those issues are still relevant in 2014, even though that story was set, in the 1940s.
Yeah, that actually leads me to one of my other questions. I mean, we were talking about how those issues still persist, which is, rightfully observed. All of his novels are set in the 30s, 40s, a couple in the 70s, and
Mm-hmm.
moving into the 60s with Pittman. But what are some other instances that you kind of see, maybe talking with your students about his relevance today with the works? I mean, you mentioned the prison industrial complex,
Yeah.
definitely with A Lesson Before Dying.
Well, Ernest Gaines writes a lot about education and the importance of education and literacy. So, if you think about a novel like A Lesson Before Dying, I mean, one of the real tragedies of that story is not just the physical incarceration and the wrongful physical incarceration, but also how the education system really fails people, like Jefferson, and how the education system is set up to fail people like Jefferson. If you look at the conditions under which Grant is trying to teach, you might think, well, that was the Jim Crow South, so clearly the education system is not that starkly different in terms of race now. But in reality, in a lot of places, it often is. If you think about the resources that are not allocated to schools in these big urban centers like DC and Philadelphia and New Orleans, closer to where you are, there's a marked difference between, again, what the school districts of those who have means and the school districts of people who are, at the low end of the economic totem pole. And so I think, Ernest Gaines writes eloquently about the conditions under which Black educators and Black students continued to struggle, right? In the 1940s, 2000s, 2010s. I mean, it's a lot of the changing same. So I think education and issues of literacy. If we think about it in a contemporary context, issues of literacy and minority rates of literacy, it's still a persistent issue. So, it's almost as though Ernest Gaines was prophetic in writing about these things that, unfortunately linger.
And I know he's commented on that, in front of actually, I think the state house or I think the state legislature, maybe the late 80s. He actually had a speech about that. But
Yeah.
definitely those things with Grant, you see him struggling with how is he going to teach these students who have no means of going anywhere.
Absolutely. And the education hierarchy is interesting. Now, you just asking this question makes me think about all this. That the education system is wrongly perceived as, quote, liberal. And but when you look at the way resources are allocated, it's not liberal at all. The people who are, again, tend to be socioeconomically dispossessed. And it's not just Black folks. I mean, it's poor white people, it's Latinos, Native Americans. The education system for these students, it does them a disservice.
And it
so,
makes me,
yeah,
talking about that makes me think about experiences that I've had actually teaching, in rural Louisiana schools,
yeah,
a couple of high schools and actually an alternative school, just the lack of resources. And sometimes you want to pass it off as a lack of care of the students, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think it's the fact that they don't have what they need to actually succeed.
yeah.
But then we get into the other quandary too, which I'm not sure if you want to answer or not even talk about, because it's a big discussion. But even the fact if literacy is gained, what does that actually gain in the long run, if anything? That's
Right.
something we talk about with Douglass, of course, and going further back in African American literature.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it clearly is an issue. I mean, Grant is clearly educated, but to what end, right? I mean, the superintendent of the schools has made it clear in that novel that he will be very limited in terms of what he's expected to teach, and he's not expected really to teach students beyond very rudimentary
Mhm.
skills that they can put use to basically keep an unjust system alive. In other words, they aren't taught, advanced things, or not taught about technology. And again, you still see this today. I mean, how different students are tracked based on what, quote unquote, their abilities are. And so when you have, Jefferson being labeled as mentally deficient, well, he's not mentally deficient. It's just like in the contemporary context where, especially Black boys are, put in classes for, remedial classes, and tracked in a way that doesn't really try to educate them beyond, a really rudimentary level.
I
Right?
totally agree with you. You see that with, the superintendent's focus just on hygiene and
Yeah.
things of that nature, which are important. And I did encounter some students that don't have that basic even foundation.
Right.
And I was teaching high schools and things too, but it doesn't seem to go much beyond that. I mean, that scene in A Lesson for Dying always reminds me of, it basically reminds me of a slave auction.
Yeah, exactly. And I also, and sort of moving, there's another scene in that novel that I think is really telling. Do you remember the scene where I think it is, I can't remember who is Grant or Jefferson, I believe, is having a dream, and they're thinking about, I think it's Grant, and he's thinking about Jackie Robinson, and he's thinking about being on death row and wanting Jackie Robinson to intervene on his. It's either Jackie Robinson or Joe Louis. I might
That's
have to look up.
that scene you're talking about is one that's always fascinated me. That's
Yeah.
when I'm getting names confused. When Grant's in the bar,
Okay.
he visits Jefferson.
Yeah.
He's the old man at the end of the bar reenacting Joe Louis and Jackie
Right.
Robinson.
Right.
Then he starts thinking about James Joyce. But then he tells the story. He says, "I remember a story of a kid in Florida who was on death row.
That's it.
And
Right.
the kid in Florida kept screaming for Joe Louis to help him, but is
Right.
Joe Louis going to help him?"
Right. And so,
I
thank
found
you.
out that's an apocryphal story. It's not a real story because Martin
Yeah.
Luther King used it too. But
Yeah.
and then he asked later too. He's like, "Is Jefferson going to call for him?"
Yeah, and that story. Thank you for clearing it up. I've got it all mixed up in my mind, right? But
Right.
that story is very telling in that Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson too probably was a product of an educational system that tracked them and saw what skills they would be most useful and profitable to other people. Not unlike what we do with young Black male athletes in a contemporary context. We have this March Madness orgy every spring, and my question is, well, what are the graduation rates of these schools? And usually they're abysmal, right? And so it's an education system that is failing them miserably, but is exploiting their Black bodies just in the same way as the school superintendent and A Lesson Before Dying is like, well, these kids are to farm and bring in crops. That's their function, right? To make profit for other people. So again, and sitting here talking to you and thinking about it really starts to make me angry, frankly.
Yeah, I understand because that's something that I've thought about and talked about with other people too. As big of a sports fan as I am, especially with college sports and football for me, I
Yeah.
have to sit and think, what are we actually doing for these students who are here? I mean, I know some are getting an education, know some are graduating. The chances of them making it into the NFL are slim to none.
Yeah.
Truth be told, NBA is even less. Baseball is a little bit higher, but I mean, what are they teaching? And when I was teaching high schools, I couldn't tell you how many times, specifically African American young men, the dream of going to the NBA. And this is high school, which it gets diminishingly smaller the closer they get to actually that pinnacle.
That's right.
What are we doing for them?
And that's the only path that's laid out for a lot of these kids. That's the only path that's laid out for them. And so again, the Gaines makes that point very starkly and very poignantly in a lot of his works. That most clearly in A Lesson Before Dying, but he brings that up in several works. That's why we started out talking about The Sky is Gray, and that one of the reasons I like that story so much is because young James in that story is clearly on a different path. He's clearly on a different path. He's on a path to literacy. He's not on that, that track in which, young black males are sort of steered into one thing. He, even though his mother is importantly trying to impress upon them the importance of knowing practical lessons, he also is attentive to his intellect. And
he mentions, I mean, he has that scene, of course, with the Reverend and the student. And Grant mentions, the only two things I could have become were, I think he tells this to Vivian, the only two things I could have become was a preacher or a teacher.
Yeah.
That's all that would have been available to me.
Yeah.
But then in The Sky is Gray, James is talking about actually missing school and the fact that he's missed it, and he's missed it so much because of having to work and other things.
Absolutely.
That's what they talk about. And one thing that stuck out to me, he's thinking, what are they talking about in school? They still talking about Edgar or Poe's Annabelle Lee. So he's cognizant of those things. And I think the same thing with the boy in The Long Day in November, if I recall correctly, too. He thinks the same things.
Yeah.
But I think all those discussions, I think, are pertinent, and I think that brings about why Gaines is still important.
Absolutely.
Things we need to think about, and things maybe we don't think about every day.
Yeah. But we're still grappling with them, and the fact that, and I'm glad that you mentioned that they, even teach some of his work in junior high schools. And so I hope that, it will propel and compel students and teachers to think about the education system itself. In other words, there's that sort of meta dimension to the discussions about Gaines, and that we just don't focus on the text, but what is the text saying about the very context in which we're reading his work,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, continuing with this just a little bit, I know you teach Gaines now in your classes. How do you usually teach him, and who do you possibly pair him with, or thematically, what do you usually do in the classroom, and how do students respond?
I will sometimes pair him, do him along with Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston when we're talking about this stuff. I remember, I haven't taught this class in a while, but one class that I've taught both as an undergraduate and a graduate level class is African American male writers in the image of Faulkner, or past the image of Faulkner. And so I'll look at several African American male Southern writers. Richard Wright. We might start with Douglass, but Richard Wright, Randall Keenan in a more contemporary context, Albert Murray. And we'll look at how these different writers talk about the South and all of the grand themes of the South, of course, race and geography and place and the color line. And especially one thing that I'm interested in is gender and masculinity. So that's one way that I teach Gaines. Another way is to think about Gaines in terms of the Bildungsroman. And so I will, we'll do stories like A Long Day in November. A lot of the stories in Bloodline actually about development and upbringing. And so we'll do that, and I'll pair him with an Albert Murray or Train Whistle Guitar, or, we'll read Black Boy alongside it. And we'll, again, in a Southern Black writers class, we'll do a Zora Neale Hurston and Alice Walker. So I like to look at him in that literary tradition of the American South, as well as looking at them in terms of other African American male Southern writers.
I think the Bildungsroman works well too. I mean, thinking about Bloodline, it's basically the progression of a 6-year-old boy up through. The last story deals with an elderly woman, but it's basically the movement through life to a certain extent in that path. How do your students typically respond to his works?
Well, I have just in the past couple of years started teaching a new course, Sexuality and Sexual Identities in African American Literature. And so, excuse me, Matthew. In that class, I've been teaching, I just lost my train of thought. I've been teaching 3 men in that class. And we've had some really interesting discussions about sexuality, heterosexuality, homosexuality, gender performance. And, these are issues that a lot of students, and they are discussed in contemporary popular culture a lot now in television and in films. And so students really have an interest in that, in terms as well as in terms of the prison industrial complex. You know, there have been a lot of shows set in prisons in the past few years, Oz and those kinds of things. So students really are interested in looking at in Gaines's work in a multiplicity of contexts.
I was gonna say, interestingly enough, you know, the identity, the gender identity, sexual identity, those types of things definitely pop in Bloodline. But then I'm thinking too of Love and Dust, which is around the same period.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a very interesting thing.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned of Love and Dust. I mean, to be quite frank, I had not read Love and Dust in years until I started this new book project for LSU Press, and so when returning to that, you know, it really is a neglected work in terms of a historical novel, and you know, and the way it deals with, you know, the plantation and sharecropping, and you know, and those kinds of issues. Yeah.
To me, and I had a professor tell me this, that was part of his best work, but I just reread it as well, and yeah, just.
And I've never taught it, so it certainly will inspire. You know, you talking about it will inspire me to teach it.
Well, for me, the subtleties of it are just impressive. Stylistically is what really grabbed me this time. It's just his style and movement through the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the other topics too of, you know, the prison. I guess we call it still the prison industrial complex. He's basically bonded out.
Right.
It goes well with three men because Proctor chooses not to get bonded out, but Marcus does in the novel. And they seem to both kind of come out of the same historical accounts from what he says to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
So thinking about all this too, I mean, we're talking about the 1960s. Where do you see placing Gaines, and this could be broad, within the context of American literature, African American literature, Southern world literature?
I mean, I think the wonderful thing about Gaines is that it's kind of like I found in doing my research on Ann Petrie. One of the things that I loved about her was that she wasn't so easy to place. And in other words, that she she fit into certain categories, but she transcended those categories, or, you know, cross categories. And so, you know, these literary categories and bins we like to construct, you know, are really, with people like Petrie and Ernest Gaines, are really permeable, you know, and I think that's wonderful. So, you know, I can teach Ernest Gaines in my American literature classes. I obviously can teach him in my American literature classes, but I also can teach him in my, you know, thematic specific classes, like, you know, gender and sexuality. I can teach him in the Bildungsroman class. And I think that is, you know, I think it's the breadth of Mr. Gaines's vision is that his work, you know, it fits into so many different areas. You know, he's spoken very eloquently about how he was influenced by, you know, the Russian novelists of the 19th century, and so therefore you can look at Gaines in a world of comparative literature course, right? So, you know, I think that speaks to the breadth of his vision.
Yeah, I think especially considering too, he's been translated, I think, 18 languages at this point.
Yeah.
And he's read in France, Japan, Russia. I mean, he's read all over the world. They just had a big read, I think, in Rwanda a couple years ago. So I mean,
and I'm glad to hear you say that. I mean, when we don't often think about Gaines in an international context. We tend to think about Baldwin and Richard Wright and Chester Himes in that way, but I think we could, you know, also, you know, position Gaines in that way as well. I mean, the fact what you just said, that his work has been translated into all these different languages, and, you know, he's spoken about the universal dimension of, you know, what he's writing about. I mean, clearly it's race and American specific, but it also can be looked at in a larger context as well.
And I'm glad you brought up, you know, Wright, Baldwin, and Himes and others who were expatriates basically and went to France.
Yeah.
You know, Gaines was initially supposed to join some friends in Mexico for an extended period of time in 1962. And they went during the summer, but he didn't go because in September 1962, you know, James Meredith integrated Ole Miss.
Yeah.
Gaines basically said, if Meredith can integrate Ole Miss, I can go back home and write.
Yeah.
So to me, Gaines fits in with the Baldwin, Himes, and Wrights as I don't like the word exile.
Yeah.
I like the word expatriate because he was expatriated from the South and from Louisiana and California.
Yeah.
So I think that he fits in with those, just not he fits in and doesn't fit in.
Right.
If that makes sense.
That's right. Yes, it does.
So, okay, a couple of other questions and then we'll wrap it up. You mentioned your current project with LSU Press. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I'm really excited about that. I, you know, as you mentioned at the outset, my first book was on Gaines and Baldwin and August Wilson, and I focused on masculinity in that work, and it was more rooted in gender theory and that. And so this book is going to be different in that I'm pitching it, or I'm gearing it towards a wider audience, and so it's not going to be sort of steeped in the the jargon of the academy, if you will. It's going to try to, I mean, clearly it will be scholarly, but it will also attempt to deal with some of the broader themes and gains, and look at those things in a nuanced kind of way. So I'm really excited that I will get to write about all of his fiction, not just not just the novels where manhood is foregrounded, although that is a lot of them, but I also will be free to talk about other issues in Ernest Gaines. And so I'll be free to talk about sexuality. I can talk about music. I can talk about folklore and those and other types of issues. I can talk about narrative technique. So I'm excited about this book.
And all of those are really important. And one thing interests me, of course, is the narrative technique a little bit, and the music. Just he's very adamant about his influences, not only of Russian authors, Irish authors, French authors, but of classical music as well, and then also the influence of the blues and jazz too. Just that mixture. I think that's very fascinating. I mean, he mentions Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition for.
Yeah, and this is an area where people haven't really talked a lot about those things in Ernest Gaines's work. I mean, the focus has tended to be on sort of the grand Southern themes, and those are important, and I certainly will be also looking at those. But think about Ernest Gaines in the tradition of the blues. I think it's important to do that. I mean, in all of his works, there's some mention of music in all of his works, and so I think that's really significant.
Yeah, I do too. So let's end on this. Just a good, easy question. Since you've read all of Gaines's work, so you're going to, what is your favorite one so far, or at this point, I guess I would say?
I have to. That's a hard question to ask. I didn't see that one coming. That's a neat softball question, but it's a hard one. Well, I've spoken how much about my just sheer reverence for The Sky's Gray, and I would also say Three Men from Bloodline as well. In terms of his novels, the first novel I read by Gaines was A Gathering of Old Men, and that novel has a special place in my heart. I read it in graduate school, and it was my introduction, and I wrote a paper on it, and I would say that novel, just because it captures Gaines is I'm going to put this. One of my friends, Hillary Holiday, is a friend of mine, and she's a critic, and she's written a book. She wrote the first book on Ann Petrie, and she used the phrase community novelist to describe Ann Petrie. And I think that also could be so nicely applied to Ernest Gaines. And so when you read Ernest Gaines, yes, you get the stories of Grant. Yes, you get the story of Jefferson. But in that novel and all his works, you also get the stories of a collectivity of people. You get a tapestry of voices in his work. And so I think A Gathering of Old Men, with those different chapters, with all of those different narrators, I think it speaks to the communality and just the tapestry, the quilt, if you will, right? We think about Alice Walker and her quilt, but you can think about Ernest Gaines's quilt of stories in A Lesson in A Gathering of Old Men. And now each of those stories, while they are very distinct, they also are a story of the community as well. And so, like the blues, they're both deeply personal, deeply painful, but deeply also there's something celebratory just in the telling of these stories. There's something transcendent just in the voicing of those individual stories. And so I think, it's that novel that captures that, that multiplicity of voices, that polyphony of sounds, that multi-voice narrative. When we think about an Ernest Gaines, we think about Richard Wright, we focus clearly on the tragedy of A Bigger Thomas. We focus on the tragedy of Cross Damon. And those are certainly important narratives. What I would think Gaines does so well is to say that these Southern gentlemen, if you will, also are part of a collectivity of people. And so it's important to hear their voices, but the quarters holds so many voices. The quarters hold so many echoes. The quarters hold so many untold narratives of people of different classes, of different races, of different ages. And so I think, you know, A Gathering of Old Men, again, you know, that novel opens with the little boy running to deliver a message. And so I think Ernest Gaines is just so keen on being inclusive in his fiction of all the different experiences and perspectives.
And I think that's so true. You know, two things to add to that. You know, we always think usually of A Lesson Before Dying with Grant and Jefferson, but if you really look at that novel, Jefferson appears at the trial but doesn't really pop up again until about midway through. It's the community that's focused on at the beginning and kind of through the middle, and then it kind of turns more towards Jefferson.
Yeah.
The other thing too, thinking about A Gathering of All Men, you know, you mentioned the community, and you weren't specific about the African American community. You said of all races, of all classes, for one in the quarters. But I think we can move that on to whites and Cajuns as well, because one of the themes in that novel is the middle scene where, you know, Gil comes and goes to his father, fix his house, and they're debating whether or not to actually go to Marshall Plantation and, you know, lynch whoever killed Bo. But that scene's told from a white narrator's point of view that's not part of the family, and his editor initially wanted that cut out of the novel, partly because of the narrator, partly because of Fix. Fix is this huge overarching character that we never see in the novel until then.
Yeah.
Everything we hear about him is negative and detrimental, and that he's vicious and is going to come and kill everybody.
Yeah.
But what you see in that scene is you see Gil come in, and the first thing you see of Fix is him sitting with his grandson or a grandchild on his lap, basically mourning the loss of his son.
That's right.
He humanizes him. And Gaines has mentioned, you know, people get onto him for painting Cajuns badly. People get onto him for painting other African Americans badly. But he said, you know, I just show the humanity in everybody, basically.
Right.
It's not one or the other. It's
absolutely
in everybody. So I think that's a key point. It is the community in the quarters, which I think is the big thing.
Right.
And bringing that a little bit further out, it's actually, you know, everybody's humanity, that universal thing you mentioned earlier.
There are no straw characters or straw men or straw women in Ernest Gaines. There's nobody there for agitprop purposes to vilify one race and to, you know, apotheosize the other. There's because life is, you know, Gaines sees that life is much more complicated than that, and people are much more complicated than that. And so in Jane Pittman, you know, the white gentleman who tells Miss Jane, we're gonna kill we're gonna kill your son. And Gaines still manages to present him in a way where he's not a monster. He's just somebody who's been has internalized a very poisonous racial ideology, and he's a victim of his teaching and of his environment. But nobody is naturally monstrous, and Ernest Gaines he understands that.
Yeah, and that's the same thing I was just thinking too about The Sky Is Gray.
Yeah.
I mean, the things in there, you see the subtle aspects of Jim Crow. You don't see it blatant. The James and Octavia's interactions in the African American community are negative, with the guy at the bar, at the diner, and then with the white woman at the end, they're cordial is not the best word, but they're not antagonistic.
Yeah,
So,
that's what when I teach that and when I show that film, I make that point that you just made about this notion of safe spaces and assumptions we have about safe spaces are going to be racial spaces. Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, at that bar, Olivia has to fight for her life and for James, and has to get the hell out of there. And so and then you find Helena there, the white woman who is who's taking a stand. She's a woman who is taking a stand. Even in this Jim Crow regime, there is a way to resist it. And I, as a white person, am going to resist that. I am not going to demonize and bestialize Black people. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Matthew. And talking about Gaines, again, presenting people in their fullness, not as stock figures, not as flat figures, but in their fullness and their complexity and their ability to do good and their ability to not do good. And that doesn't have any native color.
No, and it doesn't. And like I said, he's mentioned that before, and you definitely see it in his work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
I would like to thank you very much. And I will post the links to Dr. Clark's books in the comments and the description below. And have a good day, sir.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for your wonderful questions.
No problem. Talk to you later.
All right, bye-bye.